Imagine a quiet street, a warm sunny day. An old black man is quietly moving around in his wheelchair. Suddenly, an angry policeman emerges from his patrol car with screeching brakes. His voice sounds like thunder. Get out of the wheelchair, now. This moment is like a movie, but it's real. Moments later, an officer, seething with rage, snatches his only means of transportation from the old man. But he has no idea who he's messing with. This old man is no ordinary man, but the father of someone who is ready to do anything to restore justice. Friends, we want to hear from you. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching us from. We appreciate each and every one of you. You are not just viewers. You are our community that helps us uncover the truth and share it with the world. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help to promote our channel, and we thank you for that from the bottom of our hearts. Every response from you inspires us with new stories and lets us know we're making a difference. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. The weather outside was clear. The sun gently warmed the asphalt, and a light breeze ruffled the leaves on the trees. David Williams, a 67-year-old black man, rolled down the sidewalk in his old wheelchair. His life had never been easy, but he had learned to find joy in the simple things. Today was the one day when everything seemed quiet and measured. David was on his way to the nearest park to sit in the fresh air and admire nature. He loved this route, a small corner store where he could always buy a bottle of lemonade, and a street of tall, shady oak trees that led directly to the park. On the way, he met Miss Hannah, an elderly neighbor, who waved at him with a smile. "It's a beautiful day, David," she said. "You bet it is, Miss Hannah," he replied, lifting his head slightly. His hands, accustomed to constant work with the wheels, moved with confidence, and his eyes glowed with calmness. He felt part of this quiet corner of the city, where people knew each other, where you could hear children laughing and dogs barking. But something in the air suddenly changed. The sound of an engine broke the silence as a patrol car slowly drove past him, then stopped abruptly. It was like a black spot on the blank canvas of the day. David turned around, frowning slightly. He didn't immediately realize what trouble might be waiting for him. The man in the car looked out the window, his face unfamiliar, but his eyes had an ominous coldness. David didn't pay much attention to it. He continued on his way, trying not to think about possible trouble. But deep in his soul, he had a feeling that this day would not be as peaceful as he had hoped. "Just paranoid," he muttered quietly under his breath, speeding toward the park. On the sidewalk, he was almost alone. At that moment, he did not yet know that in a few minutes, his world would be turned upside down. The sound of screeching brakes made David stop. The patrol car, gleaming brightly in the sun like a predator stalking its prey, stopped abruptly at the sidewalk. The loud squeal of brakes echoed along the quiet street, shattering its peaceful calm. David turned around slowly. The car door opened with a bang, and a man in uniform stepped out. He looked to be about 40, with a heavy, sullen face and a fierce gaze. The nameplate on his chest read, "Officer Harper." "Hey, you!" the policeman bellowed, his voice louder than necessary, as if he wanted to attract the attention of the whole neighborhood. "Get out of that baby carriage, now!" David frowned. His heart slowed, then doubled over. He looked around that empty street, hoping to see someone who might come to help, but the sidewalk was empty. "I'm sorry, officers. There's been some kind of mistake," he began calmly, though anxiety began to brew inside him. But Harper would not listen. His footsteps were heavy, almost menacing as he approached. The officer's hand rested on his holster, showing that he was not going to be ceremonious. "I said get up," he shouted again, taking a sharp step forward. "But I can't get up," David answered quietly, pointing to his wheelchair. His voice shook, but it tried to keep his dignity. The policeman squinted, anger flaring in his eyes. "You can't get up, can you? We'll see about that." He threw and shoved the baby carriage, causing it to sway. "Stop, what are you doing?" David's voice got louder, but it still sounded helpless. Harper abruptly grabbed the wheelchair by the handles and pulled it back with force. David, trying to hold on, instinctively grasped the armrests, but his weak arms could not compete with the officer's brute strength. The wheelchair tilted, and David felt the ground rapidly approaching. He hit the pavement sideways, pain shooting through his shoulder. But that wasn't the worst part. He saw Harper looking at him in disgust, as if he were garbage he'd just thrown out of his driveway. "How many times do I have to tell you? These streets are not for the likes of you, Harper hissed, leaning over him. David tried to raise his hand in a gesture of protest, but the policeman stepped on it with a heavy boot, cutting off any attempt at resistance. You've got the papers for that stroller. He asked dryly, or did you steal it? David was silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because fear had completely overwhelmed him. It seemed to him that this day, so calm and bright, had turned into a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. Meanwhile, Harper straightened up, pulling a walkie-talkie out of his pocket. We've got a suspicious subject, black, mid-60s, trying to pass himself off as an invalid. I suspect the wheelchair is stolen, waiting for backup, he said coldly, as if it were routine. The silence of the street sharpened again. Only David's intermittent breathing and Harper's heavy footsteps filled the air. The shadows of the oaks no longer seemed a defense, but only increased the feeling of helplessness and loneliness. But that was only the first act of the spectacle of cruelty that Officer Harper was about to play out. David lay on the cold pavement, trying to gather his thoughts. The pain in his shoulder reminded him of how helpless he was now. The wheelchair, his only means of transportation, was in the hands of Officer Harper, who was twirling it around as if he were inspecting a product before buying it. Stole it, Harper hissed, looking at the stroller. Do you know how much it's worth? People like you like to grab anything that's not worth it. It's my stroller. David tried to object, but his voice shook. The policeman didn't listen. He lifted the stroller off the ground and lowered it to the asphalt with a clatter. Where are the papers on it? Or maybe you could show me the receipt. David inhaled deeply, trying to keep from crying. He knew it wouldn't help. That tears would only cheer this man up. The papers are at home, officers. I can get them, he said, trying to speak calmly. At home, right, of course. Harper laughed loudly, but there was no good-naturedness in his laughter. You mean you want me to just take your word for it? You think I'm an idiot? David felt the blood rush to his face. No, sir, Sir, Harper interrupted him, leaning in so close that David could smell the tobacco on his breath. Don't call me that. You don't deserve it. A crowd of passers-by began to gather at a safe distance. People stopped, pulled out their phones, but no one dared to come any closer. Harper turned toward them, his face contorted in an angry grimace. Let's disperse. There will be no circus, he shouted, and if anyone else tries to take pictures, I'll confiscate them as evidence. David struggled to rise on his elbows, his gaze darting from Harper's face to the crowd. He looked for a single person who dared to intervene, but no one moved. People just stood there, whispering among themselves, afraid of becoming the next victim. Is there anything else you want to say? Harper turned his attention back to David, who tried to sit up. Why don't you tell me how you got this wheelchair? Or did you win it in a lottery? It was public assistance. I'm an invalid, David said, feeling the humiliation come over him in a wave. Harper frowned mockingly, as if trying to show sympathy. Oh, so you live on taxes, too. You know what I hate most about that? He pointed his finger at the wheelchair. That my honestly earned money goes to people like you. With every word Harper said, David felt something inside him crumble. The pain of the words was sharper than a blow to the ground. I didn't take anything from you, he mumbled, lowering his head. Of course you didn't. You just sit around and wait for others to bring it to you on a platter. I'm tired of people like you. Harper spat on the pavement beside him. A shadow of despair appeared on David's face, but it tried to hold on anyway, not for his own sake, for the sake of those who were watching, for the sake of his son, who always told him, Dad, hang in there, no matter what. But Harper wasn't going to stop. His next move was going to strip David of even a shred of dignity. David, lying on the ground, tried to speak again. His voice was quiet but filled with desperation. Officer, you have to understand. I didn't do anything wrong. It's my wheelchair. I'm an invalid. But Harper didn't let him finish. His coarse laugh sounded so loud that it attracted the attention, even of those who were walking down the neighboring street. Listen, old man, stop lying, he shouted, looking at David with contempt. You think I don't know your kind? You've probably figured out a way to make everyone around you feel sorry for you with your stories. David raised his hand, trying to point to his feet, which were lying helplessly on the ground. I really can't walk. Officers, I have a spinal injury. But Harper did not let him finish again. His face was red with rage. and his voice was even louder, more shrill. "I don't give a damn about your injuries. Every one of you is just making excuses. You're nothing, sitting in that wheelchair because you're too lazy to get up and work." David felt fear clenching his chest more and more tightly. He was helpless in front of this man, who seemed to be looking for any excuse to vent his hatred on him. "That's not true. I've worked all my life," he tried to answer, but his voice sounded weaker and weaker. Harper stepped closer, his shadow over David. He'd bent down so that their faces were level, and squinted at him with a chilling calmness. "Your life is a pathetic lie. I can arrest you right now for resisting the authorities. Understand?" "But I'm not resisting," David replied in a shaky voice. "I'm just trying to explain." Harper straightened up sharply and kicked the stroller, which rolled a few meters and hit the curb with a loud thud. "You're explaining to me," he shouted, spreading his arms to the side as if addressing everyone around him. "I'm the one asking the questions here. I'm the one who decides who you are and what you've done." David felt fear clenching his chest more and more tightly. He was helpless in front of this man, who seemed to be looking for any excuse to vent his hatred on him. "That's not true. I've worked all my life," he tried to answer, but his voice sounded weaker and weaker. Harper stepped closer, his shadow over David. He'd bent down so that their faces were level, and squinted at him with a chilling calmness. "Your life is a pathetic lie. I can arrest you right now for resisting the authorities. Understand?" "But I'm not resisting," David replied in a shaky voice. "I'm just trying to explain." Harper straightened up sharply and kicked the stroller, which rolled a few meters and hit the curb with a loud thud. "You're explaining to me," he shouted, spreading his arms to the side as if addressing everyone around him. "I'm the one asking the questions here. I'm the one who decides who you are and what you've done." The old man felt hot tears start to come to his eyes. He looked at the gathered bystanders, but no one moved, as if they were all part of a silent auditorium. The crowd was only silent, the occasional sound of smartphone cameras, but no one dared to intercede. "Will you obey me, or will I make you regret every second of your life?" Harper said threateningly. The words, spoken almost in a whisper, sounded even more terrifying than his screams. David tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it only made him feel more helpless. He felt the ground beneath him become icy, despite the warmth of the sunny day. Every glance of the passers-by, every word of the policeman only increased his fear. He was not just helpless physically, he was helpless morally, humiliated and destroyed in front of everyone. But somewhere in the back of his mind, another feeling began to stir, barely perceptible. It was like a smoldering spark. He knew this day wouldn't just end. He knew he had to survive to tell this story. David tried to rise from the cold asphalt, but his weak arms trembled, unable to find a foothold. He felt like an insect under the boot of a man who had decided to crush it just for the fun of it. Harper stepped closer, treading heavily, his face twisted with anger. "You think you can play the victim here? You think that's going to save you?" He bent over the old man. David looked up, trying to find a shred of humanity in that face, but met only hatred. "Officer, please, I didn't do anything wrong," he mumbled. "Shut up." Harper straightened up and kicked the stroller, which flew farther away, hitting a lamppost. "You didn't do anything, did you? Then why are you lying here like garbage?" At that moment, muffled cries were heard from the crowd. People were whispering, filming what was happening on their phones, but did not dare to intervene. However, one man, a young guy in a cap, couldn't stand it and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing? It's an old man. Leave him alone." Harper turned around at the voice, his eyes darting a look of contempt. "Who are you, hero? You want me to hold you up, too?" he growled, pointing his finger at the boy. "I'll count to 3 and get you out of here." The boy took a step back, but didn't leave. Harper grinned and turned back to David as if he were his toy. "Listen to me, old man," he continued. "You think you can hide behind your disability, but to me you're just a thief and a crook." And before David could say anything, Harper grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and started pulling him up. The old man cried out in pain, trying to grab the officer's arm, but his efforts were futile. "Get up," Harper shouted, his face red with anger. "You came here, so you might as well get up." David, unable to resist, collapsed heavily back onto the pavement as the officer's hands loosened. The blow hit his side, and he groaned in pain. His glasses flew off his face, shattering on the sidewalk. "Stop it. This is too much," A woman in the crowd shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of Harper's angry reply. "Everybody shut up, or I'll start arrests." David, lying on the ground, tried to get up on his elbows, but Harper kicked him in the side again, as if he were just a bag of garbage. "You wanted to talk? Then talk. How did you get in here? Why are you using that wheelchair? Show me the papers on it right now." The old man could answer nothing. His breathing was ragged, his eyes closed in pain. He felt his body betraying him, refusing to fight. The crowd began to murmur. More and more people pulled out their phones, filming the inhumane spectacle. Harper, noticing this, straightened up and looked around. "Take as many pictures as you want," he shouted with a grin. "Do you think it'll hurt me? I'm just doing my job." But there was already a note of irritation in his voice. He knew he was losing control, but he couldn't stop. Suddenly someone in the crowd shouted, "We'll get it out. You can't hide it." Harper turned to the crowd, his face twisted in anger, but something like fear flashed in the depths of his gaze. He turned sharply back to David, grabbed him by the shoulder, and shouted, "You think you can humiliate me? If I were you, I'd pray I'd be taken out of here alive." David lay still. He realized that every minute of this nightmare was leaving an indelible mark not only on his body, but also on his soul. He felt completely destroyed, but something still smoldered inside him, a faint hope that justice would prevail. The crowd that had gathered was beginning to murmur. People looked on in disbelief and horror. The old man lying on the pavement, his broken glasses, the stroller lying on the curb, and Officer Harper standing over him like a predator ready to strike again. It all looked so wrong that many onlookers instinctively pulled out their phones to record what was happening. "Hey, you can't leave it like that," came a voice from the crowd. "I'm already filming it. It needs to be shown," replied the other one. Harper, noticing the phones, raised his head, his face contorted with rage, and he took a step toward the crowd, pointing his finger at those who were fuming. "Put your phones away now," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. A few people stepped back, but not everyone obeyed. The cameras continued filming, and the whispers in the crowd grew louder. "Is it bullying, this man?" asked the woman with the child. "This is an abuse of power. Someone has to intervene," said the young guy standing closest to the policeman. Harper turned sharply toward him, his hand resting on his holster. "You want to talk about it?" he hissed. "Take a step toward me, and I'll find something to hold you for." The boy frowned, his face pale, and he backed away slowly. This only irritated Harper. He looked around the crowd with contempt, as if he were looking at a herd of animals. "You all think you're heroes," he shouted, spreading his hands. "You think you know the law? I could arrest every one of you for obstruction of justice." "What kind of justice?" shouted the woman with the phone in her hands. "You're beating up an old man." "It's the suspect who's fighting back." Harper raised a finger, pointing at David, still lying on the pavement. "Do you even know what he did?" "Of course I don't, but I do. So shut up, put your phones away and disperse." But the crowd did not disperse. People kept filming, their outrage growing. A few people began to shout words of support for David. "We're going to publish it," shouted the man with the camera. "Let everyone see how you treat people." Harper, hearing this, took a step toward the speaker, his face red with anger. "Do you want to end up like him?" he growled, pointing at David. "I'll give it to you." But at that moment, there were more voices in the crowd. People began to speak louder, and a few moved closer to the sidewalk. Harper turned around, his eyes darting from one person to the next, and he suddenly realized that the situation was spinning out of control. "Everybody back," he shouted, pulling out his baton. "Whoever makes a move on me will go to the station." The baton glinted in the sun, and the crowd shuddered. People began to look around, their shock and anger struggling with fear. But the phones remained raised, the cameras still recording, capturing every second. On the ground, David tried to raise his head. He saw the men begin to show the strength of their presence. Their eyes reflected something more than fear, it was determination. "This video will be on the news," someone in the crowd shouted loudly. Harper exhaled sharply, his chest heaving heavily. He was cornered, but he couldn't stop. The crowd was beginning to realize that their numbers were their strength. That realization was slowly but surely robbing Harper of his confidence in their impunity. James, David's eldest son, Saturday in his office, absorbed in his work. He was flipping through pages of reports, staring at the small numbers on the screen. but suddenly his phone vibrated on his desk. Drawing his attention, James frowned, looked at the screen, and noticed a message from one of his friends labeled, "Did you see this?" When he opened the link, he found a video that instantly awakened a flame of rage in his chest. On the screen, his father, David, lay on the ground in a wheelchair, defenseless against an aggressive police officer. Officer Harper, standing nearby, yelled, humiliating him, and kicked the wheelchair like garbage. David tried to explain himself, but his words were lost in the din of the policemen shouting. Every moment James watched the video, his heart clenched tighter and tighter. He knew his father, always calm, strong in spirit, a man who didn't complain even in the most difficult moments. But here, in front of this policeman, he was nothing, helpless, humiliated. James gritted his teeth, feeling a storm of anger and pain come over him. He couldn't sit idly by. Thoughts flashed through his head quick, clear as lightning. He picked up the phone, wasting no time in thinking, and dialed the number of the lawyer who represented their family in human rights cases. "Hello, it's James. We're in big trouble. My dad, he's just been beaten up by a cop. It's all on video. We need to act now." His voice sounded hoarse, anger rising out of him. The lawyer answered quickly, his voice businesslike, though there was anxiety in it. "James, I see. I've already gotten that video. We'll act on it immediately, but we need your testimony for that. Try to gather information and keep in touch. We will call activists to organize protests and draw attention to this case." James hung up the phone and looked at the screen again. The video wouldn't get out of his head, and he realized that this was just the beginning. All these years he had tried to be strong, to support his family, but now, in this moment, he felt completely helpless. His father, who had always been a pillar of support, was being victimized. He took a deep breath and began dialing the numbers of the activists he was associated with. Literally after a few minutes, his phone started ringing again and again. James couldn't afford to waste a second. "Hello, James, we're with you. There will be no consequences." The voice on the other side was determined. "We need to take to the streets, hold a rally, make a statement. We'll take this case to the local media, show what's going on." He nodded, feeling the strength building in his chest, losing his peace, but he wasn't going to be silent. He knew he had to fight not only for his father, but for all those who suffer injustice, who were silenced in the shadows of this cruel system. As soon as he was done talking, James jumped up from his chair and started searching the internet for anything that could help. News, commentary, witnesses, anything that could be used to give the Harper cop a fight back. He knew it would be a long road, but he was ready for it. When James looked at the video again, he saw his father's eyes reflecting pain, humiliation, but also something else, something that gave him hope. It wasn't the end. James swore to himself he would not let this incident go to the back of his mind. Harper, this policeman who had beaten his father, would surely be punished. As James began to delve deeper into finding out more about Harper, he quickly realized that this wasn't just a chance encounter with a cop. Harper was known around town, and not for the best of reasons. His name would pop up in the news from time to time, but it always disappeared as quickly as it appeared, as if an invisible hand was covering his tracks. James felt his nerves begin to tense, and he kept looking. Soon his eye stopped on an article in the local paper, which was titled, "A Cop with a Dark Past, Harper Back in the Spotlight." The article spoke of several instances where Harper had been seen roughing up black citizens, but in each case he had gotten away with it. At first it looked like rumors, but James couldn't ignore the coincidences. The article mentioned his co-workers who knew about the incidents, but did nothing about it. Harper's support was huge among his co-workers, and they all seemed to stand behind him despite his racist views and brutality. This defense allowed him to remain in office, despite numerous complaints and even internal investigations. He always got away with it, thanks to old connections and the patronage of high-ranking police officers. James clenched his teeth as he read about Harper's past. In one case, where an officer was accused of beating a black teenager in the arena of a public event, an investigation was conducted. However, as in other cases, the results were inconclusive and the case was closed. Each time, Harper came out untouchable, and James knew it wasn't fair. The sense of pressure was growing. Harper wasn't just a cop. He was part of a system that covered up cases like this, and his actions were only a small part of a broad problem that encompassed the entire department. With each step of the investigation, James could feel this information squeezing his chest, making his heart beat faster. He couldn't let this go without repercussions. He realized that if he didn't start fighting for his father, and for those who suffered at the hands of cops like this, the whole system would remain as it was, dishonest and unpunished. As much as James wanted justice, he knew it would be a hard road to get it. Not everyone in the police force was ready to admit their mistake, and if Harper continued in his position, the whole dirty game could happen again. "We can't let him stay on duty," James muttered under his breath, staring at the screen. "We need to take this to the next level." He knew that to get justice, he would have to act decisively, and that meant he'd have to face the powerful machine protecting Harper. But he was ready. James couldn't let his father be just another victim whose voice wasn't heard. James spent the next hours preparing. He contacted activists, human rights activists, sought legal help, researched every aspect of Harper's actions, and gathered all the evidence. He knew that all eyes would now be on this case. They had to be ready for any confrontation. James wasn't naive. He was well aware that Harper was part of something bigger, but that knowledge only strengthened his resolve. If he didn't bring this man out into the open, if he didn't bring this matter to a head, then no change in the system would ever happen. Harper was only part of that system, but he could be the first to be punished, and James was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The video of David's incident instantly gained popularity on the internet. First, it appeared on the pages of local residents, and then, like a snowball, it spread all over the web, reaching the hands of human rights activists, journalists, and people ready to fight for justice. Cell phones, social networks, news portals, everything was filled with this amazing material. People could not remain indifferent. Instantly, there was an immediate reaction, thousands of comments, demanding the truth and punishment for Officer Harper. Users expressed their shock and anger, many of whom may have encountered such a phenomenon for the first time. "How is this possible in the 21st century?" One commenter wrote, "This is simply impossible. We should all stand up for this man," raise his voice to another. Similar posts and comments appeared in literally every corner of the internet, and the wave of outrage grew by the hour. Almost all well-known human rights organizations responded. The popularity rating of the video only grew, and more people began to raise the issue in society. The media, which had previously preferred to avoid such cases, now could not ignore the resonance that the Harper case had caused. Within hours, numerous reports on the incident filled the airwaves. Finally, one of the news channels broadcast not just information about the incident, but a call to action. "We stand on the threshold of change, and today we can finally give an answer to a question that has plagued us for years. How many of these cases are we willing to tolerate before something changes?" said the anchorwoman live on air, addressing the audience. "Citizens, tell me, do you have the strength to fight the system that protects such police officers? Today, it is not just one man's life that is at risk. Today, our entire justice system is at risk." Such media appearances stirred up the public. Soon several large activist groups, as well as local organizations, began planning rallies and protests. Gradually, the protests began to take on a mass character. People who wanted to show their support for David began taking to the streets with placards demanding punishment for Officer Harper. The words "Justice for David" and "Harper must be held accountable for his actions" became slogans that united people of different ages, races, and professions. It was a powerful, unprecedented protest against racism and police brutality. But attention to the cause was not limited to local protests. Soon global activists, such as Black Lives Matter and other human rights organizations, began to join the cause, organizing peaceful demonstrations around the world. "We can't be silent anymore," said one activist in an interview. "This is not just an incident with a police officers. This is a situation that millions of black people face every day. Harper is not the only one. We demand that there are no more police officers like him." The video became a symbol of the struggle against systemic injustice. It was not just a violation of the law, it was another confirmed story that the system that is supposed to protect actually does the opposite. James, who had been watching this resonance, felt the tension building. He saw support growing. People began to respond, not only on a social media level, but also on a personal level. offering their help, organizing protests, and providing legal assistance. It was like a chain reaction. But the more the video spread, the more pressure Harper and his colleagues came under. They realized that despite their efforts to silence the incident, the public would not back down. We cannot allow this case to become just another little problem that we just keep silent, said one of the protest leaders. We will continue to fight until justice is done. Harper will not go free. The public awakening process was set in motion. All of this was the beginning of something much bigger than just a local case. James felt that they had a real opportunity to change the system and punish those who were perverting it. When James saw the scale of support that was growing around the incident with his father, his resolve was strengthened, but deep down he knew that in order to achieve true justice, he would need to do much more. He had always tried to be quiet and humble, but at this moment, in the face of such injustice, he realized that he had a far more important role to play than he had ever imagined. For many years, James preferred to remain in the shadows. Avoiding open attention, he actively participated in human rights activities, supported various projects and initiatives, but always remained in the background, emphasizing other people, leaders who could be relied on. His influence was serious, but hidden. He was a member of the local parliament, and his name was known among those concerned with human rights and social justice, but he rarely made headlines. However, the incident with his father changed everything. The situation was becoming more tense by the hour, and James suddenly realized that the only way to bring about real change was to use all his resources and influence to put pressure on those who supported Harper and force the system to react. This is not just a personal tragedy, he told himself, looking at the photos from the protests. This is a struggle in which I have a key role to play. I can't let the system stay silent when people's lives are at stake. Suddenly James realized that his connections in politics could be a decisive factor. He knew that it was not only the legal process that was important in such cases, but also the pressure on the authorities to create from the outside. He decided to act decisively. One of James' strongest tools was his close contact with influential people in the media. As a deputy, he had access to key channels of information, and now that the whole city was in protest, he decided to use the media to escalate the situation. His connections with journalists, editors, and even major TV stations were key to this. He knew that if they could pull the story to the forefront and make it not just local but national, Harper and his allies couldn't just go unpunished. James also knew that he had tremendous power behind him. His reputation in politics was built not only on his beliefs, but also on the results he achieved when working with different groups. He was a man who was able to find common ground with even the most diverse people, which gave him the ability to influence different parts of society, from the mayor's office to big businessmen. Nevertheless, his inner conflict was palpable. James realized that his involvement in the struggle for justice had gone further than he had imagined. He knew that by using his position he could influence many processes, but he was also aware that his actions could provoke both support and harsh criticism. Little did he know that he was not just an activist, but a man with political clout who could put all his experience and connections on the line to win this battle. I can't let this case become just another story about the system covering up for a cop again, he thought as he walked into his office. We're going to fight to the end. I will do everything in my power to bring honor back to my father and to all those who have been hurt by the system. James knew that his decision could change not only his family's future, but also affect how this situation would unfold citywide and possibly nationwide. He was ready to use his resources to free his country from this burden of racism and police brutality. If I don't fight for my father, then who will? He pondered, realizing that his shoulders now bore not only a personal tragedy, but responsibility for a much wider range of people. James could feel an incredible power brewing within him, ready to confront the system itself. He was no ordinary activist, and now it was all beginning to add up to something more. When the Harper investigation was officially opened, it was the first real blow to him. At first, nothing seemed to change. He continued to walk the corridors of the police station with the same smug expression on his face, as if he were surrounded by an inviolable wall and was still invulnerable. However, the situation was becoming more tense by the day. First, he was suspended from the service. It was a formal decision that nevertheless symbolized the beginning of the end for Harper. He was no longer allowed to go out on patrol. He was left without his uniform, without his usual night duty, without the sense of authority he had so enjoyed. And while this decision was only a temporary measure, everyone knew that the consequences could be far more serious. However, there was no way Harper could accept this situation. In his eyes, he was not a criminal, but a victim. With each passing day, his self-confidence turned into a real paranoia. He claimed that it was all part of a political campaign, that they were trying to destroy him not for his actions, but for his beliefs, for his views. He vehemently denied that he had done anything wrong, assuring those around him that his actions were justified. He was convinced that all this was the result of a conspiracy of activists and the press, who use him as a target for their own purposes. This is a political witch hunt, he repeated to his colleagues. I can't be accused of something I didn't do. This is a war against everything I believed in. The officers who had been supportive so far tried to reassure Harper, saying it was all temporary, that things would calm down. But with each passing day, his behavior became more erratic. He could no longer hide the fact that his reputation was on the verge of collapse. The press, which had previously paid no attention to his little misdemeanors, was now watching his every move, and his every word was becoming news. In his conversations with his colleagues, he often expressed regret that he had failed to notice in time how serious those who opposed him were. This was not just another discontent on the part of a few undesirable people, but a real popular protest that could not be turned back. Harper, feeling the ground slipping away from under his feet, began to blame everyone around him, his service, his family, his colleagues who he felt had betrayed him, and even the system itself, which, he said, cannot protect true patriots. He increasingly shut himself off from the reality in which he found himself, convincing himself that, despite the accusations, he was still right. His house, once full of confidence and pride, was now tensely silent. His wife, who had once supported him in everything, now looked at him apprehensively. She could not understand what was happening to her husband. At times she saw in his eyes the same rage and aggression that she had seen on his face when he had torn apart the old man's wheelchair. But now all that rage was directed at those who had betrayed him. Why don't they realize that I was just doing my job? Harper said in an impotent rage, glancing at the television screen, which was again showing coverage of the protests. It's all just a campaign against me, against all of us. His wife was silent, not knowing what to say. She had long ago realized that he was no longer the man she had once been with. Harper had not only lost his job, but also his own inner integrity. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to move forward. More and more evidence of racial discrimination, beatings, and other violations were sought in his actions. Each new discovery and each new piece of evidence strengthened the charges. The public pressure was becoming unbearable by the day. And yet, despite the enormous public outcry, Harper persisted. He was unwilling to admit his guilt, unwilling to see that his actions had caused suffering, that he was part of the problem, not the solution. He was looking for excuses, looking for the culprits around him, not realizing that, ultimately, it was his own behavior that had caused his downfall. With each new investigative report, with each accusation, his life shrank more and more, and he himself felt that his end was coming. Regret and remorse would not come. Harper couldn't admit his mistake, couldn't believe that he was the one who was now being judged. Months of struggle, public protests, pressure from human rights organizations and journalists, and James' personal determination bore fruit. Harper's trial ended on a high note for the old man's family, despite all attempts to defend his actions and justify his behavior. This time justice was not turned away, and Harper was convicted not only for his violence, but also for the systemic discrimination and racism evident in his actions. The public condemnation was unrelenting. All the same media that at first may have tried to leave this case behind. What do you think about this story? Have you ever had an experience with racism? We really value your opinion, and it's important for us to know your thoughts and experiences. Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to share if this topic is close to your heart. Every comment you make helps us grow and make content that matters. Your likes and subscriptions make us stronger, and we are truly grateful for every support. We appreciate each of you, and each of you is important to us. We wish you a great day, filled with positivity and strength to face any challenges.